not because of bottom-up evangelism from a bunch of engineers, but because one strategist at the top saw the potential power of this method and then essentially imposed that vision on everyone underneath him.
When I completed the paper, I first gave a copy to Mark Andreessen, who was co-founder of Netscape and was at the time in the senior management team at Netscape. Mark then gave a copy of the paper to several other people within Netscape management, including Jim Barksdale. I'm not sure exactly when Jim and the other senior managers made the actual decision. I believe it was in early January sometime. Netscape actually announced that it was going to release the source code on January 22nd, at the same time that they released that they were going to give Communicator away for free. When Netscape decided to release the source code, people sort of got a wake-up notice that said, hey, maybe there is something to this idea of releasing source code and doing development with people outside your company. So Netscape's decision brought a lot of public attention to the idea of free software, what became known as open source, and brought a lot of attention to the Linux operating system, which was one of the most prominent examples of open source software at that time.
This is our first office, Mountain View, California. We moved here in early 1995. This is 4,000 square feet. It was an incredible leap of faith for us to move out and take the company to our own office. Now, what's really important about this place is that this is the office where the term open source was invented.
If you walk into an executive's office and you say, free software, okay, if you're lucky, the response you'll get is something like, free software must be cheap, shoddy, worthless. And if you're not lucky, it has associations with the Free Software Foundation's wholesale attack on intellectual property rights, which, regardless of what you think about the ethics of that, it's lousy marketing. It's not something that businesses want to hear.
So Eric Raymond knew that there was a problem. We'd been calling this free software, but people took the term free and associated with free of charge. They thought that you couldn't make money or you couldn't sell, which is exactly the wrong concept. We wanted to get across the idea that the software was open and that the source code was available. Very important pieces. We had this meeting at the VA offices in Mountain View where Eric, myself, and Christine Peterson from the Forsyth Institute joined us, as well as several other people.
Christine Peterson was there by phone. John Mad Dog Hall was also there by phone. A guy named Todd Anderson, who later worked for SUSE for a while, was there. Sam Ochman, who now runs Penguin Computing, was there. He was an employee of VA at the time.
Well, we came up with the concept of open source. We called Linus, in fact, and asked Linus if he liked it. He was interested. He liked it. Eventually, we came up with something that replaced free software. So that was the beginning of open source.
How did you choose the words open source? Do you remember?
I think Christine Peterson was the person who really came up with the idea. We wanted, again, the idea that the source code was out there and it was open. There weren't many choices.
Well, since the first three recipients have spoken for the open source movement, I think I should speak about the free software movement. The open source movement focuses on practical advantages that you can get by having a community of users who can cooperate on interchanging and improving software. I agree completely with the points they make about that. The reason why my views are different, why I am in the free software movement rather than the open source movement, is that I believe there's something more important at stake, that freedom to cooperate with other people, freedom to have a community is important for our quality of life. It's important for having a good society that we can live in, and that is, in my view, even more important than having powerful and reliable software.
But I think some of the people in the free software camp are a little scared by the commercialization. And, of course, a rebel is put off by success. I think that commercialization is very important. We want to mainstream this software. And I work with Richard Stallman, who's the gray-haired man of free software, on a regular basis, and I don't feel I have any philosophical differences me as author of the open source definition, and he is originator of free software as an organized thing, except for one thing. Richard wants all software to be free, and I think that free software and non-free software should coexist. That's the only difference we have.
We decided early on that what we needed a definition. We needed a kind of meta license to define the term open source. And what we came up with is a document called the Open Source Definition. It's derived from the Debian Free Software Guidelines that were originally written by Bruce Perens.
I had written the original draft of that, discussed it for a month with the Debian developers. Debian is a Linux distribution, and made it their project policy. And Eric and I decided to relabel what we'd written for Debian as the open source definition, and to say open source is software that gives you a list of 9 rights, which is in the open source definition. The first right is free redistribution. This doesn't mean free as in no price, it means liberty. You have to be free to redistribute your software to someone else, and actually no price is a side effect. You can charge for that redistribution or not. It has to come with source code so that someone can maintain a program. If they go from a PC to a Mac, for example, they can change the software. Derived works have to be possible. If someone has to improve your program, they should be able to distribute the result. There's a provision about integrity of the author's source code, which says that the author can sort of maintain their honor, and if you make a change, you might have to change the name of the program or mark out your change very clearly so that your change doesn't reflect on the author. There's no discrimination against people or groups. The example I usually use is you can't stop an abortion clinic or an anti-abortion activist from using the software. There's no discrimination against fields of endeavor, and that means the software has to be usable in a business as well as in a school. The license has to be distributable. In other words, I have to be able to give that license to someone, and that license then should work if that someone gives it to yet a third person. The license can't be specific to a product. In other words, if I distribute my software on a Red Hat system, the license can't say, you can't distribute this on a SUSE or a Debian system. The license can't contaminate other software. So if I distribute this on a CD with another program, it can't say that other program must be free, otherwise you can't distribute my software. And then the only other part of the open source definition is a list of licenses that were accepted. And the ones that we started with were the GPL, which was actually the example for a lot of what's in the open source definition, the BSD license, because software for BSD system pre-existed Linux.
I think the next moment that I thought was really pivotal was when the database vendors flipped over, which happened about 3 months sooner than I expected it to. It actually happened in late July, early August. That we got commitments to do Tier 1 ports from Oracle and Sybase and the other key database vendors.
And why was that critical?
Because we knew that in order for the open source story to be credible, and especially in order for the Linux story to be credible, we'd have to get commitments from independent software vendors to do ports of their applications to these platforms. And I was actually kind of worried. I felt that we were in a window of vulnerability between the time that we announced the open source campaign and the database vendors flipped over. That was the point at which hostile action by Microsoft or other closed source software companies, that was the point at which a serious marketing blitz might actually have sunk us. But once the big database vendors flipped over, that opened the way for other ISVs. That started a snowball effect going.
Every 6 months or so, I would come back to the venture capitalists and I would show them the new numbers, showing more and more people adopting Linux, the new people porting, new users, and I'd show them our customer list. And our customer list was getting much more impressive. It was people like Cisco that were beginning to appear. People like the .com companies were starting to show up on our customer list, and eventually the venture capitalists, they kept looking at it and they kept saying, oh, we can't quite do it. Finally, Linus appeared on the cover of Fortune because there was something happening with open source. Well, at that point, the venture capitalists couldn't ignore it. They just got sick of hearing about Linux everywhere, and they got tired of me just showing it to them every at that point almost every week. So they decided it was time to invest, that there was something happening.
Well, I announced open source to the world on the internet. I did a lot of the early administrative work of starting the open source initiative. And I think 6 months later, I was reading the words open source in the news all the time and was totally astounded. And a year later, I believe Microsoft was talking about releasing some source code. And someone in the press asked Steve Ballmer if they were going to open source their code, and Steve Ballmer said, well, open source means more than just releasing the source code. And I realized that he had read my document and understood it and was now telling the press about this. Now, if you're like just a guy on the net who's not doing this for a job at all, and you sort of write a manifesto and it spreads out through the world, and a year later the vice president of Microsoft is talking about that, you'd think you were on drugs, wouldn't you? But that's what really happened.
The local user groups tend to be more an issue of building a social network, especially getting people familiarized with the issues, also just acting as a kind of support network for people who do not, for example, have the ability to pay for a commercial support network. So one thing they're doing in this area, for example, is they're making these, I think it's once a month, they're having install fests, which means that people who have problems getting Linux installed on their machine or have some issue, I mean, maybe they've actually installed Linux but want to set up the network in a specific way, can actually bring in their machines to this users group meeting. And there's a lot of people there willing to help who've maybe seen that problem before.
So the card that only connects locally, go back to this side.
Well, actually things aren't going so well. I tried it earlier myself. I had problems, and so I came to this install fest where all the gurus abound. Hopefully I'll have better luck getting it in.
Instead of sending emails or writing to news groups on the internet and waiting several days for the answer, sometimes it's easy to come here and find other people who might know about your problem and may be able to help you. And hopefully within a few hours you have your machine installed.
Originally I wanted to install on my larger laptop, and so I just did a search on the net and found where there were resources to get help. And I'm here today because I'm trying to put Linux on this little guy right here, which is a Toshiba Libretto. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do because it's a weird piece of hardware. So, how many chairs around here?
I think the Department of Justice case has made people aware of the fact that you should at least look for alternatives to Microsoft, and maybe Microsoft isn't the American dream after all. And that kind of shift in perception, you can very clearly see that people just took Microsoft for granted. And maybe they're still buying Microsoft, but at least they're kind of more aware of the issue these days.
Microsoft actually used Linux as defense. They used Linux to ground a claim that they don't have a monopoly because Linux could essentially push them off their catbird seat at any time. It was a very ingenious argument, totally specious, because it didn't do anything to answer the charge that they had previously engaged in bullying and various anti-competitive practices. But it was clever of them. In an event, the judge didn't buy it.
Well, ordinarily we in the Linux community are rather wary about letting Microsoft become the issue, but there was a Slashdot article about December of '98, where a fellow named Matt at the Noodle had pointed out that a gentleman in Australia had managed to receive a refund for the unused copy of Windows that came with his computer. So he declared the 19th of January, was it January?